Sorry to chivvy you all. Welcome back. Nice to get a small cup of tea. Now we are ready for a major treat. Professor John Hume is one of the great eminences, a gentleman of many parts. For many years at Strathclyde University, a lecturer in economic and industrial history, but that's only the beginning. He really is one of the founding figures behind industrial archaeology, and a great photographer and documenter of Scotland's industrial heritage. Many, many, many unique photographs of some of the most extraordinary buildings and structures to which the public didn't generally have access, and many of which were destroyed during the deindustrialization of the 60s and 70s onwards. But even that doesn't begin to cover it, because John is chairman, head convener of an endless number of different heritage and amenity groups, like Robin Webster, one of these persons who simply doesn't retire, in charge of all sorts of things, and a great Svengali figure behind what makes things interesting for us here. So I'm greatly honored, greatly honored to introduce Professor John Hume, who is going to talk about John Honeyman's architecture. Thank you very much.
I hope you'll forgive me if... Can you hear me? Yes. I hope you'll forgive me if I sit down. My knees, after many years of walking around factories and churches and so on, are not as good as they used to be, so I would be more comfortable sitting down. Because, in a way, you've heard personal details from some of the speakers before. I should say that my father was organist at Battlefield East Church, which was one of... Honeyman built the first church at Battlefield East, although I haven't even included a slide of it because it's not really very good. What I think you will find about Honeyman was that he was a man who was a very pat architect. He was very good when he was very good. He was always competent. David Walker said everything he built had a quiet distinction, a scholarly fastidiousness, and above all a gentlemanly quality as the man himself. And I think that's true of everything he did. Everything was well done, but at his very, very best he was terrific. And Gordon has told you how terrific he was here, but he was terrific in other places. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a quick conspectus of, first of all, his church buildings, and I've got most of them on slide, and then we'll take a very quick look at his non-ecclesiastical work. And I'm not going to illustrate, other than by one photograph, an important aspect of his practice, which was his interest in and his involvement in the genuine historical medieval fabric of Scottish churches. He was involved in or advised on a work to, for example, Brechin Cathedral, Glasgow Cathedral, Iona Abbey, Largo Parish Church, St Michael's in Lithgow, which you saw stained glass windows in, and a number of other buildings. He was a founder of the Glasgow Archaeological Society, and he was a founder of the Glasgow Architectural Society. And throughout his life, he had a very, very real interest, antiquarian interest in the real. A great friend of David McGibbon, of the great Scotland and the Church of Scotland, and indeed was a man who had very wide contacts and was a very good friend to many members of his own. Many of the Royal... Thank you. Is that all right? Can you hear me now? No. Well, can we do something about that? Is that better? Yeah, right. I'll hold it like that. Is that better? That's fine. Okay, that's fine. As well as his architectural work, Honeyman was very good to his colleagues and introduced many of them into membership fellowship of the Royal Institute of British Architects, of which he was a member of council for many years. Right. So with Honeyman was born in Glasgow. He was the son of a corn merchant, and he was born in Carlton Place, where his father at that time lived. And he had, through his father, he had connections with quite a number of the business community in Glasgow, just as the business community in Glasgow rallied round to build this church. So Honeyman was enmeshed, if you like, in a great body of business people in Glasgow, and to some extent they gave him work. But more important than that, he had the security, in a sense, of being part of a bigger picture. His clients included J.R. Napier, who was the son of Robert Napier, the father, so-called, of Scottish shipbuilding. He was quite close to John Elder's widow, Isabella Elder, and indeed modified the house that she occupied up in Circus Park area. He originally intended, when he left school, to enter the ministry. He studied at Glasgow University. Whether he graduated or not is not clear. But he then decided that he would rather move down to London, which he did, and he studied accountancy for a year. Then decided he didn't like that, and I'm not surprised. And then moved in to work with William Byrne, who by that time, although an Edinburgh architect, was working down in London. And he studied architecture there and took the opportunity, while he was in London, to look at what was going on in terms of church building in the area, which was very active and where the Gothic revival was really, really flourishing. So it's not surprising that most of his church architecture, was in that mould. So if we can have the first slide, please. Honeyman's first direct experience of church building on his own account was in relation to two churches, one in Glasgow and one in Greenock, which had been designed by J.T. Emmett, who designed, among other churches in Scotland, designed Renfield St Stephen's in Bath Street, which is a very fine and very academic Gothic revival building. This rather modest building externally, which is Sandiford Henderson Memorial now, the Honeyman took over the management of the contract for this when Emmett died. And this church is designed, as you can see, with a nave and side aisles, which was popular with the ecclesiastical movement led by Pugin in the south of England, and Emmett used this model for his churches. Notice there's no spire. It's a very simple design. Very effective design. The only problem with this church is that the east is east, or rather slightly southeast. So during services on a Sunday, the sun shines through the east window and dazzles the people sitting in the nave. And therefore, when I was chairman of the what's now the Committee on Church Art and Architecture, we had to approve blinds to take the light, the worst of the light, out of the sanctuary during services. Next, please. This is a church that nobody here, I expect, will know. If they do, I congratulate you. This was St Thomas's in Broome Street in Greenock, which was the other Emmett church that Honeyman took over. It is, as you can see, it was converted into a warehouse, but the underlying distinction of the design is still there. It's a very beautifully detailed building. I'm not sure whether it still stands or not. It's certainly, it's quite a number of years since I photographed it. But that was another of Emmett's churches that Honeyman had a hand in. Next, please. There it is again. That's a side view. Next, please. His first church, which he designed on his own, is this one here, the Free West Church in Greenock, and you can see it's an accomplished bit of design. It has the rose window, which was a characteristic of many Free United Presbyterian churches during the middle of the 19th century. It was originally intended to have a spire. Next slide, please. which was never built. But if you will see here quite a close similarity to the overall concept of the design of this church. The spire set towards the end of the church and lean-to side aisles, and with a stair to a gallery at the back in this case. Next, please. This has been long demolished. His next church was Helensburgh Free, and you will see here, which is just recently closed as a church. You'll see here again the rose window. You can see the 3-aisle design. I can't see one of the aisles because the steeple is in front of it. But it is therefore it's in the Emmet tradition. But it's a nice design with an asymmetrically placed steeple. Very nice steeple indeed. Next, please. And the next one, of course, was Lansdowne, which opened a year later, 1863. These slides are copied from pictures in Gordon's book with his agreement. I put these in to show just what a dramatic feature of the landscape it was. And this is true of a number of Honeyman's churches. They were designed to be eye-catchers as well as places of worship. Next, please. This picture here shows the juxtaposition which Gordon showed in his presentation. It shows the church in relation to the new Kelvin Bridge, which incidentally was built in order to carry an increased supply of water to Glasgow underneath the road in large pipes, possibly made by one of Mr. Law's successors, which you can still see. Next, please. This is another view which emphasizes, as one should, the height and slenderness of the steeple, which is the most eye-catching and remarkable feature of this church, which is held in place by an iron rod running down through the stonework, so that it gives the necessary strength to stop it blowing over. Next, please. And that again emphasizes the slenderness of the steeple, which is probably the slenderest steeple of its type, and in fact I'm sure it is, in Scotland. Next, please. Another church which is not so well known, and I photographed it in its latter days. This is not one of my photographs, it's an Annan photograph, which followed very soon after Lansdowne, was St Andrews in Charlotte Street, the Free Church, St Andrews Free Church in Charlotte Street, down near Glasgow Green, where it was inserted into one of the house plots of the original Charlotte Street. You can see two complete houses and another one on the right, part of another on the right, which were laid out when the street was built in the 1770s. And you will see how this church has been slotted in, therefore it only has a street frontage. It doesn't have really an effective presence as a body of a church. But notice the similarity in the detailing of that gable to the south transept here. Next, please. And that is a picture of the interior, which again from Gordon's book, which shows the very elaborate structure, cast iron columns, elaborate timber roof, wheel window, and a screen not 1,000 miles away from the screen that was here, but rather smaller. It's obviously been taken after an organ has been installed. Has a central pulpit, has a railed area in front for the choir or elders, or both perhaps. Really a very fine example of a free church interior. Next, please. This is another of the high points of Honeyman's church design. This is Dumbarton High Church, Dumbarton Free Church, which is now in commercial use. And again, this is a church was designed fundamentally as a street frontage church, but very, very nice, very handsomely detailed, and by far the grandest church in Dumbarton, and indeed in the whole of West Dumbartonshire in its day, 1864. So that these churches and the next one are all built within something like a 4 to 5 year period. Next, please. One that you will be familiar to many of you is St Silas in Eldon Street on the approach to the university, This is a very interesting building because it was designed for a Church of England congregation in Glasgow, not an Episcopal Church congregation, although it's now part of the Scottish Episcopal Church. Again, the wheel window, which seems to have been so fashionable, very, very fashionable in the 1850s and 60s. Next, please. And the three-aisle treatment again, which you saw earlier on. And this is, you can't now see this view because a new church hall was built on the left a few years ago. Beautifully detailed. Not one of his most beautiful churches, but the detailing is superb. Next, please. And another one that will be familiar to most of you. This is the former Trinity Congregational Church at the end of Berkeley Street, which was used as rehearsal space for the Scottish National Orchestra for many years. A nice, decent church with a very, very good acoustic, which is why it was chosen for the rehearsal space for the RSNO. It's now, I think, been converted to other uses, but I don't know quite what. The opposite now is the new Gurdwara, or the new Sikh building. Next, please. And again, another fairly small and simple building. This is a Lockerbie Free Church, which is although it looks big, it's got a big presence in Lockerbie because the surrounding buildings are quite low, but it's quite a small building, almost next to the railway there. And this is fairly characteristic of the kind of smaller scale buildings for which Honeyman was responsible. Next, please. One church that I'm very sorry we've lost. I think we lost it largely because it had the same problem with soft sandstone that this church had. This is the old Barony Free, which was opposite the Royal Infirmary in Glasgow, just a block up from the Province Lordship, which had a very interesting saddleback steeple. Saddleback steeples are not at all common in Gothic revival in Scotland, as I think it's French, largely French in inspiration, but a handsome building and an original building. And this is the first real evidence we have of serious originality in breaking away from the mould of the Gothic revival as set in London and as adapted by Honeyman when he came up here. Next, please. And that's a photograph which shows it in its latter days, and it really became a very sad building. It was eventually pulled down. Next, please. And this is one, again, that most people won't know. This is Partick Free Church, which was not far from where I live. If any of you know Todd's Brae, which runs down from Partick Hill Road to Peel Street, it was in the angle there was now a block of flats. And here we have again an original treatment, a nice simple treatment with it was on an angled site, and this was the frontage to the angled site. It has a central entrance, as you see, and the central entrance was something that was favoured by the Hayes of Liverpool, who were influential on Honeyman in his earlier days. Next, please. This is Aberfoyle Parish Church, which was originally designed by J.T. Rockhead, and where first of all Honeyman came in to complete the building as originally designed, and then he built the extensions, which you can see here, the transepts, and I think probably the apse, as the chancel on the gable there. That's the east end of the building. The main body of the building was designed by Rockhead. Next. One of his the churches that Honeyman was responsible for, which almost matches this church in terms of its impact on its environment, is this one, which is St Matthew's, Perth, where it is on a riverfront street that was actually laid out to take account of this building as a focal point building. It's not a desperate original design, but it's a design with the most magnificent presence. It really forms the character of that part of Perth to this day. Next, please. That's a view of the steeple, which is a very, very handsome example of that generation free churches. This church was commissioned by a wealthy bleacher just to the north of Perth, for whom Honeyman later designed a whole block of workers' housing, which is very good workers' housing. Next, please. This is an unusual one. On the whole, Honeyman favoured very firmly the Gothic revival in one form or another, but this is Admiral Street Methodist Church, which was opened in 1871, now demolished. And those of you who know John Street Church, which is now converted to a restaurant in the city centre, will recognise the way in which the windows have been inserted into the classical frontage. And my feeling on this one, without having any evidence for it at the moment other than visual evidence, is that this is a church which in fact Rockhead had been involved in designing before Honeyman took over Rockhead's practice in I think 1870. It's certainly a loss to Glasgow. I think it's a very fine building of its type. It's a great shame that it didn't survive. Next, please. This one is yet another Gothic revival church. You do get a routine, don't you? You do think yet another steeple Gothic revival church, free church, with the corner pinnacles and the octagonal steeple. This one is in Kirkcudbright. It's now a flats. It's St Mary's Free Church in Kirkcudbright. Next, please. And again, this is another rather grander church, St Philip's Church and Free Church in Musselburgh or Joppa. Now St Philip's Joppa. Next, please. And that's another picture of the same church. Next, please. And one which has gone, and you'll see a similarity here. This is the Candlish Memorial in Govanhill, on Cathcart Road in Govanhill. Not long before it was demolished. There were originally tenements along the road on the left, so it's not seen in the way it was originally intended. But you can see the same formula. Next, please. And yet another one. This is the Buchanan Memorial, which was just off Caledonia Road, which was eventually cut down and then demolished during the Gorbals comprehensive development area in the 60s. Next, please. This is a wee bit different. This is the a Porter Menteith church, a small church, with a very interesting end window, but built of the same sort of dreadful sandstone as the ones we mentioned. He was not a good chooser, or he did not choose contractors who were very good at stone. The same goes for Greek Thompson. Greek Thompson's stone was usually extremely poor, and you'll see that to this day in Caledonia Road Church. And if you compare these architects with the Adam family in the 18th century, the Adam family had an uncanny eye for stone, and most of the buildings they built stand to this day with almost no loss of detail at all. Next, please. An unusual approach here, because we have here essentially a Romanesque building, St Anthony's in Govan, Roman Catholic Church, the only Roman Catholic church that Honeyman ever built. I think the reason why he was commissioned to build this was of the family connection with the elders, because this church is very close to the Fairfield shipyard. And I think that may well be the connection, though I haven't got any documentary evidence for that. Next, please. Another view, that's the frontage, which shows you it's very much a North Italian Romanesque type of building. Next. Again, suffers from very soft stone. Well, I think one of his most attractive and successful churches as an overall composition, I think, is this one here, which is Westbourne, which was built for a free church congregation in the West End. Next, please. And that gives a very good impression of the church as originally built. The use of two successive orders of columns, Ionic with Corinthian above, is unique, I think, in the whole of Scotland. The flanking towers give it a kind of liveliness and a sense of adventure which is absent from more strictly classical building. And the asymmetric hall combination on the left, I think, makes up a very, very satisfying composition indeed. And you'll notice that the colonnade is actually inserted into a broken pediment, which ties the whole thing together in a very, very nice way. I think a lovely, lovely piece of design. Next, please. This is one I put in just out of interest, because this is Ballachulish Church, Church of Scotland Church, which was built at the same time as Westbourne. And here, what he did was he added the top of the tower and put in a gallery to give you and added the porch, which you can just see behind the bushes there. Next, please. His only Edinburgh church, as opposed to Musselburgh, because Musselburgh at the time wasn't a part of Edinburgh, is St Michael's in Slateford Road, which has a tower, comparatively rare in his oeuvre. Next, please. And that's from the other end, and you'll see the similarity of the detailing of the East End to churches like Lansdowne, but the very unusual feature of the cap house on the tower for this architect. Incidentally, when he married for his third time, his previous two wives died, so there wasn't any divorces involved. He chose to be married here. Now, he married a lady with whom he had been living, as far as I know, so that might be why he chose to be married in Edinburgh rather than in Glasgow. Next, please. This is a late example of his work. This is the church at Loch Gilphead, which replaced a Telford church, one of Telford's standard Highland churches of the 1820s. And he very, very carefully sited this church so that the tower is not in the centre of the view up the street, the main street of Loch Gilphead. It's to one side, slightly out of view, which means that the front of the church is very good to look at, but it's not so much of an eye catcher that it destroys the atmosphere of the street as a whole. It's a very clever bit of thinking there. Next, please. This is the last church that I think he was responsible for. Whether, in fact, Keppie, who by that time was his partner, had a hand in this or not, I don't know. This is Barony North, which was built as a United Presbyterian Church, and is now a Covenanting church, effectively. But it is a very, very interesting, really Renaissance building. It's the only really Renaissance building, with the possible exception of Westbourne, that he designed. And it's got the four apostles along the tops of the columns, along the body of the church, and there are also statues of St. Paul and another saint in the niches above the two entrances. Next, please. There's the tower, which is a most elegant piece of design. May have been to some extent modelled on the cathedral church, what's now the cathedral church in Birmingham. Next, please. And there's an angled view which shows the apostles along the top. Now, a really very sophisticated piece of design, and well, as a man who was getting towards the end of his career, I think a very bold and novel design. Next, please. And that, I just put that in. It's from David Stark's wonderful book on the practice of Honeyman's firm, Charles Rennie Mackintosh and Company, published in 2004, and it shows restoration in progress at Brechin Cathedral. The man in the hat is the minister. The others are tradesmen, and they're putting the finishing touches to the chancel, the choir, which is the light area to the left, and they lay a concrete floor, which is really very up to date. Next, please. And I thought I would conclude with a few examples of his practice in non-ecclesiastical practice, 1856. This is Knockderry Castle, which was later extended by Leaper, and the authorship of this is in some doubt, but I think the general view I would take is that it was designed by Honeyman. Next, please. His first contract for a Glasgow building was this one, Jamaica Street, the one in the middle, next to what the old Gardener's furniture warehouse, which was designed for G&J Burns, the ship owners, with whom he had a family connection. Next, please. The Eagle Pottery in the East End of Glasgow, now last demolished, 1869. Next. One of his most successful designs for a secular building, Paisley Museum and Library of 1868 to 70, which he later extended. Next, please. An office for the City of Glasgow Bank in Paisley, the one on the corner there, which he built between 1870 and 1872, only 6 years before the City of Glasgow Bank collapsed and caused his practice great distress. Next, please. That's a very nicely detailed building, as you can see. Next. This is one of his houses, probably the most elaborate house that he built, which is Achamore in Gia. Next, please. This is, I beg your pardon, that's the Cliff in Skelmorley. That's Craigie Hall, which is now better known for the Macintosh interiors, which were inserted later on. Next, please. The Cadora building, now extended by 2 bays on the right, but a most superb piece of cast iron frontage design, a kind of lightness of touch that is missing from other early cast iron fronted buildings in Glasgow. Originally built as a furniture warehouse, then a tea room, a celebrated tea room, the Cadoro and restaurant, and now offices with shops on the ground floor. Next, please. For practice, did a number of schools. Tureen Street School, 1875-6, is one that I believe still survives. Next, please. That's the extension on the right to the Paisley Museum when a library space was needed, which was built in 1882. Next, please. And at the same time, he also built the Coates Observatory up the hill behind the museum, which has got a lovely telescope where you can watch the stars to this day. Next, please. This is his grandest country house, Achamore on Gia. Next. He also designed the Elder Park in Govan for Isabella Elder, the widow of John Elder, and opposite the Fairfield Yard, which Elder had founded. And that's a modern aerial photograph taken by the Royal Commission, showing the layout of the park. It's the park has been altered in various respects, but the basic cross-shaped layout of the driveways is still there. Next, please. This is one I think that Kepi had a hand in. This is Dunlow, a big villa in Weems Bay, but I think there's quite a lot of Honeyman in that. Next, please. And that I think that probably Honeyman had a good hand in. This is the Gilson Hall now in Cardross or Cardross, which was built for the local volunteers. And as he was himself a volunteer officer, I think he probably had quite a hand in that. He went blind in his later years over a period of probably about 10-15 years before he died. He became increasingly blind. And as a result, he wasn't able to do much design work at all. He relied very much on John Kepi, later on Charles Rennie Mackintosh, and he concentrated in his last years in practice on his church restoration work, which I've alluded to. That's it. I hope I've given you something of a feel for the generality of his architecture. He did quite a lot of other things I haven't shown you. Did a lot of villas and so on, which were not really desperately interesting, if truth be told. If you want to read more about these the practice, then the best source undoubtedly is David Stark's wonderful book, Charles Rennie Mackintosh and Company, published in 2004. And of course, Gordon Urquhart's notable ornament book gives you a lot of additional information on the practice as well as on the detail of this particular building. And finally, I want to refer to David Walker's Dictionary of Scottish Architects on the web, which is a wonderful source. And he's got 24 pages on Leaper, not Leaper, on Honeyman. Where Honeyman stands in relation to other architects of the period, I wouldn't even attempt to comment. He was a very good architect. At his best, he was brilliant. He turned out a lot of what I would call journeyman stuff, but I think we have to judge him by the best of his buildings as we would other architects. Thank you.